My name is Sergeant Reese Calloway. I'm 33 years old, and 11 days before my brother's wedding, I was lying in a hospital bed with 3 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and a concussion that made the ceiling lights feel like they were drilling into my skull, when my mother called to ask if I could please keep my name out of the news because it would, in her words, overshadow Cole's week. She didn't ask if I was going to be okay. She asked about timing. That phone call is the reason I'm telling you this story, because 3 days after I came home in a sling, my mother stood in my doorway holding a navy dress on a hanger and asked me, gently, sweetly, like she was doing me a favor, to leave my uniform in the closet at my own brother's wedding. I almost did it. I have spent my whole life almost doing what they asked. But 9 days later, in a ballroom full of people my family had spent 6 months trying to impress, a stranger stood up in the middle of his own toast and said a name. My name. And nothing in that family was ever quite the same after that. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlights, the channel for the people who spent their whole lives lighting the road for everyone else and never once got to ride in the passenger seat. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one nobody worries about because you never give them a reason to, you already know how a story like this starts. Drop a comment and tell me the moment you finally stopped dimming your own headlights for somebody else's comfort. And make sure you're subscribed, because where this one goes, you will not see coming. You should know who I was before that hospital bed, because it explains everything that came after. I've been a state trooper for 9 years, the last 4 of them working nights on Route 9, the stretch of highway that runs through Granger County like a vein nobody thinks about until it gets nicked. I work the dark hours on purpose. Less traffic to manage, more room to actually do the job, and something about driving toward trouble instead of away from it has always made sense to me in a way most things don't. My apartment is small and tidy. My duty bag sits by the door, packed and ready, the way it's been since the academy. I'm not married, but I've been with Theo for 3 years, a paramedic who works the same ugly hours I do, which means we mostly see each other in hospital parking lots and over gas station coffee at 2 in the morning. And somehow that's still the most stable relationship I've ever had. My family is a different kind of stable, the kind where everyone knows their role and nobody's allowed to switch seats. My mother, Pam, decides what the Calloways look like to the outside world. My father, Gene, goes along with whatever keeps the peace. My younger brother, Cole, gets to be easy and charming and a little reckless, because somebody in that house always has to be the one who isn't a problem, and from about the time I was 12, that job was mine. I kept my grades up so nobody had to ask. I paid my own way through community college, and then the academy so nobody had to help. When I graduated and pinned on my badge, my mother hugged me in the parking lot, smiled for exactly 1 photo, and spent the drive home asking if I'd thought about going back to school for something more, in her word, sustainable. I want to be precise about something, because it matters for everything that comes later. My mother does not hate me. I used to think she did, in the bad years right after the academy, when she'd introduce me to her book club friends as my daughter who's still figuring things out, while I was out there running radar and pulling people out of ditches. I don't think that anymore. I think my mother is afraid of exactly what I represent, and I didn't fully understand why until a folder showed up on my hospital tray table 11 days before my brother's wedding, and a 71-year-old man explained it to me in 4 sentences. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get there. Here's what you need to know about my grandfather first, because none of this works without him. Walter Voss is my mother's father. He spent 26 years as a trooper himself, the same uniform, the same roads, 2 counties over, before a jackknifed trailer put him in a wheelchair for the better part of a year when my mother was 16. I didn't know that part of the story until I was almost 30. What I did know growing up was that Grandpa Walter showed up to every single one of my milestones that my mother skipped. My academy graduation, my promotion to sergeant, the night I got my first commendation for pulling a family of 4 out of a flooding creek bed, an event my mother described to her friends, when she described it at all, as Reese had kind of a wild week at work. Grandpa Walter flew out for that one, sat in the 2nd row, and afterward gripped my hand so hard it hurt and said, "I know exactly what that took. Don't let anybody in this family tell you it didn't." Cole met Annika Pierce about 18 months before any of this, at a charity gala his work made him attend, the kind of event he usually complained about for a week afterward. This one he didn't complain about. Annika was warm and a little shy in a way that surprised people who only knew the Pierce name from billboards, because her father, Richard Pierce, owns Pierce Auto Group, 11 dealerships spread across 3 counties, the kind of business that puts a family's name on little league jerseys and hospital wings. When Cole called to say he'd proposed, my mother cried on the phone for almost 10 minutes, and it took me a minute to realize she wasn't crying about Cole. She was crying about arriving. "We're finally going to be the kind of family people take seriously," she told me, and the word finally sat in my chest for days afterward like a splinter, because I'd spent 11 years in a job people genuinely respect, and it had never once made my mother feel like she'd arrived anywhere. Annika called me herself about a month into the engagement, which surprised me, because nobody in my family generally thinks to include me in anything until there's a task attached to it. She asked about my job. Not the polite version people usually ask about, the one where they're really asking how soon they can change the subject. The real version. What a night shift actually looks like. Whether I was scared the first time I worked a fatal accident. She listened to the answers like they mattered, and at the end of the call she said, "I'm really glad Cole has a sister like you." And I didn't know what to do with that, because nobody in my own family had said anything close to it in about a decade. I should have paid more attention to what kind of family raises a daughter who says things like that. I was too busy being grateful for 15 minutes of feeling like a person instead of an inconvenience. The wedding was set for a Saturday at the end of October, at a place called Sterling Oaks, a converted estate 40 minutes outside town, with the kind of grounds that look like they were born knowing how to host a wedding. 11 days before that Saturday, I was working the overnight shift on Route 9 when a cold front rolled fog in off the reservoir thick enough that my headlights just bounced off it and came right back at me. Around 1 in the morning, a box truck heading the other direction hit a patch of black ice on the bridge over Miller's Creek, jackknifed, and took out the guardrail. By the time dispatch got the first call, there were 6 vehicles involved, and a sedan flipped onto its roof, with the driver trapped inside and the engine already smoking. I was first on scene. I want to tell you I remember weighing the risk, doing the math troopers are trained to do before they go toward a fire. I don't remember any of that. I remember the smell of fuel and the sound the man inside that sedan was making, which wasn't screaming. It was worse than screaming. It was the sound of somebody trying to stay calm so he doesn't waste his last clear minutes panicking. His name, I'd learn 11 days later, was Richard Pierce. At the time, he was just a voice, and 2 hands reaching for me through a window that had buckled wrong. I got the door pried far enough to cut his seatbelt and drag him out by the collar of his coat, and I remember thinking, with the strange clarity your brain hands you in moments like that I had maybe 90 seconds before the smoke turned into something worse. I got him clear. I handed him off to a man who'd stopped his truck on the shoulder and was already running toward us with a fire extinguisher he probably kept for his grill. Then I turned back toward the wreck to check the second vehicle, because that's the job. You don't get to stop at one. And that's when a pickup sliding on the same ice that started the whole thing clipped me from the side and put me into the guardrail hard enough to break 2 ribs, fracture my left wrist, and rearrange my understanding of time for about 40 minutes. Somebody on the shoulder, a stranger with a phone, got a photograph in those first few seconds before the second impact. It's a strange picture if you've seen it. You can't see my face. You can only see the shape of me silhouetted against the wreck, backlit by 6 sets of headlights all pointed in different directions because of how the cars had scattered, smoke curling up gold in the high beams behind me. The local news ran it the next morning under the headline, "Trooper in the High Beams Pulls Driver from Burning Wreck." It got shared a few thousand times in our corner of the state, which in a place like Granger County is basically viral. Nobody knew it was me. The department doesn't release names right away, for safety reasons, and I was unconscious for the part where it would have mattered anyway. What I remember after that is fragments. A backboard. A helicopter I don't actually remember being inside, but apparently was. Theo's face when I came around in the trauma bay, gray and furious, and trying not to let either of those things show. And underneath all of it, the dumb, persistent worry that I was somehow going to be late for cake tastings, because even half-conscious with a tube in my arm, some old reflex in me was already running the numbers on what my mother would say. Theo called my mother from the hospital hallway sometime around 2 in the morning, because that's the job too. Somebody has to make the calls you can't make yourself. He told me later, almost embarrassed for her, exactly how that conversation went. He said I'd been in a serious accident, that I'd been hurt pulling a man out of a burning car, that I had broken ribs and a fractured wrist and a concussion, and they were keeping me overnight for observation. There was a pause on the line. Then my mother asked if it was going to be on the news, and if so, whether they'd used my full name. I didn't believe him when he told me that. I made him say it twice. Then I lay there with a tube taped to the back of my hand and felt something in me go very still, the way it does right before you stop expecting an outcome you've been hopping for despite all the evidence against it. She did call me directly the next afternoon, to be fair to her, and I want to be fair, because what's coming isn't kind and I'd rather be accurate than cruel. She asked if I was in pain. She asked if I needed anything. And then, in the same breath, with the same tone, she said, "I'm so glad you're okay, sweetheart, but please tell me you didn't give your name to any reporters. The last thing we need right now is your job's drama splashed everywhere a week before your brother's wedding." Your job's drama. I had pulled a man out of a car that was actively on fire and broken half my ribcage doing it, and to my mother, the real risk was that it might draw attention away from the seating chart. Cole called that evening, which I'll give him credit for because at least he called. "Mom said you got hurt. That's insane. Are you okay?" he asked, and for about 4 seconds I thought maybe this was going to be a normal conversation between siblings. Then he said, "Hey, unrelated, but you're still cool wearing the navy dress instead of, like, the uniform thing, right?" Annika's mom asked again, and I realized the 4 seconds were over. My grandfather walked into my hospital room a little after 8 that night, 3 hours after Theo's call to my mother, moving slow on the cane he's hated for a decade, carrying a soft, battered manila folder under one arm like he'd been carrying it around for longer than just that day. Nobody had told him which hospital. He told me later he just called the two within an hour of Millbrook and asked for me by name until somebody confirmed I was a patient. He didn't say hello first. He looked at the cast on my wrist, the bruising coming up dark along my jaw, and he said, "Your mother told me you had a fender bender." Then he sat down in the vinyl chair by the bed, set the folder on his knee, and said, "I drove past 2 exits before I believed that's all it was." I asked him what was in the folder. He told me it wasn't the night for it, that I had enough to carry already, but that he wasn't going to let me walk into that wedding not knowing a few things first. The first thing he told me was about himself, about the trailer that put him in a wheelchair when my mother was 16, about the year that followed where money was thin, and the town they lived in then was small enough that everybody knew the trooper's family was struggling, and about the particular kind of shame that settles into a teenage girl who wears the same 2 pairs of shoes through an entire school year because her father can't work and the department's disability pay doesn't stretch. "Mother decided a long time ago that the uniform meant being poor and being pitied," he said. "She never once let herself notice that it also meant being the kind of person who runs toward a burning car instead of away from it. She only kept the part that scared her." He was quiet for a second, turning the folder over in his lap. "I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive her tonight. I'm telling you so you understand you didn't do anything wrong by becoming exactly what she ran from." Then he told me the second thing, which mattered more, even though I didn't understand how much until later. He said he'd been keeping an eye on my mother's finances for years, not out of nosiness, but because something about her sudden country club membership and the new lease on her Lincoln and the high-end dental work never squared with the tight year stories she kept telling at Sunday dinner. He said he had a folder of his own, separate from the one sitting on his lap that night, that he'd put a trust together a few years back, quietly, with a lawyer in town, specifically because he didn't trust my mother to manage so much as a lemonade stand without it ending up funding something that made her feel important. "I'll tell you the rest when you're not on painkillers," he said. "But I wanted you to know there's a floor under you. Whatever happens at that wedding, you don't fall all the way." He left the folder he'd brought sitting closed on the table beside my bed and said he'd take it back when I was ready, that some truths only count for something if they're told with everyone in the room. Then he kissed my forehead, which he had not done since I was probably 9 years old, and walked out slower than he'd walked in. I didn't sleep much that night, partly from the ribs and partly from something Grandpa Walter had said that wouldn't sit still in my head. I'd been sending money home for 7 years. I knew the number existed somewhere. I had never once let myself add it up, because some part of me understood that the total would be a door I couldn't walk back through. So at 11 o'clock at night, propped up at a 45-degree angle with my unbroken hand, I opened my banking app and made myself look. There were 3 recurring transfers. The first, labeled Dad's Shop, $600 a month, going back to when his small engine repair garage needed a new compressor, and I told myself I was being a good daughter. The second, labeled Mom House, $700 a month, meant for the mortgage. The third, labeled Coal Help, $500 a month, started the year he moved out and never quite stopped. $1,800 a month for 84 months. I make a trooper's salary. I picked up every overtime shift Granger County offered for almost 7 years to make that number work, and I never told a single person, including Theo, exactly how much of it there was, because saying it out loud felt like admitting how much I needed them to need me. The app did the arithmetic without flinching, the way apps do. $151,200. I sat with that number the way you sit with a verdict. I do accident reconstruction for a living. It's the part of the job people don't think about, the part where you take a scene that looks like total chaos, 3 crumpled cars and conflicting witness accounts and skid marks that don't make sense at first glance, and you turn it into a clean, documented timeline that holds up in a courtroom. So that's what I did with 7 years of bank statements, sitting in a hospital bed with one working hand, pulling up the records half a day after I'd needed an exact figure for a wreck I'd accidentally caused myself. The real numbers, when I sorted them out, weren't close to the story I'd been telling myself. My father's actual garage expenses, the legitimate ones, came to about $18,000 across 7 years. The real mortgage payments, the ones that actually touched the house, came to about $9,000. That left $124,000 unaccounted for, and once I started tracing it, it split clean into 2 lanes, like 2 cars peeling off the same stretch of highway in opposite directions. The first lane ran almost entirely to my mother, about $97,000 over 7 years. A country club initiation fee and 7 years of dues. A personal stylist retainer she described to relatives as a little treat to myself, cosmetic dental work, and most of the payments on a leased Lincoln that had replaced a perfectly functional Honda the Year Cole started dadding Annika. The second lane ran to my brother, $27,000 total, including a $12,000 upgrade on Annika's engagement ring that I'd been told, at the time, was a family loan against the shop, and a $15,000 deposit on the Sterling Oaks venue that had been pulled from the same account 2 weeks before the invitations went out, labeled, when I finally found it buried under a transfer description that read Dad Roof, as Cole Venue. My father's roof, as far as I could tell from 7 years of records, had never once been repaired. I want to stop here for a second, because if you followed me this far, you might already be the person I'm about to describe. I pulled overtime for 7 years believing I was keeping my father's garage open and my parents' roof over their heads, and what I was actually doing was paying for a country club membership and a ring upgrade nobody told me about. If you've ever sent money on faith, pull one statement tonight. Just one. Read it like it isn't yours. And if any of this feels familiar, hit subscribe, because what happened 9 days later in that ballroom is the part you came for. I canceled all 3 transfers from that hospital bed before I let myself sleep. 3 taps, maybe 15 seconds. 7 years gone the way a faucet shuts off, and I felt nothing close to triumph, just a strange, flat clarity, like a scene report that finally balances. I went home 4 days later in a sling, with strict instructions to avoid stares and stress, both of which I broke within 72 hours. My mother came by on day 3 days before the wedding, carrying a navy dress on a hanger like she was bringing me a casserole. She laid it across the back of my couch and said, "I thought you could wear this Saturday. It's your size." I told her I'd planned on wearing my dress uniform, that troopers wear them to weddings and funerals all the time, that it was perfectly appropriate. She was already shaking her head before I finished the sentence. The Pierces are very particular people, Reese. A uniform is going to bring up the accident, and frankly, with your arm like that, it's going to look like we're, I don't know, accident-prone. Just wear the dress. For once, blend in. There it was. The same sentence I'd been hearing in different shapes since I was 12, finally said plainly enough that I couldn't pretend I'd misheard it. "Can you just," she said, softer now, "the way people get right before they ask you to disappear. For one day, not be a cop." I told her I'd think about it. She smiled, relieved, squeezed my good arm, and went back to her car to call the florist about a centerpiece issue. I sat on my couch next to that navy dress for a long time afterward. I'd carried heavier things than a dress before. This one still felt like it might break something in me that the guardrail hadn't managed to. 2 days before the wedding, my cousin Mara, who has never once had an unkind thing to say about anybody and clearly didn't intend to start now, accidentally forwarded me a screenshot meant for somebody else. No message, just the image, sitting there in my texts like a hand reaching across a table. It was from a thread called Wedding Logistics. My mother, my father, Cole, 2 aunts and 4 cousins, every Calloway who mattered, minus exactly one. My mother had written 3 days earlier while I was still in a hospital gown. "Quick note for everyone, Reese is not wearing the uniform Saturday. Please don't bring up the accident or her job unless she brings it up first. If anyone from Annika's side asks what she does, just say she works for the state in some administrative capacity. Let's keep Saturday about Cole." Underneath it, a thumbs up from my aunt, a single word from Cole, "Fine," nothing at all from my father. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I went very still, the kind of still I get on a scene when panic would only get somebody else hurt. For 7 years, I told myself a story where my family didn't understand what I did, but underneath the confusion, they were proud. That story died on my couch with that screenshot still glowing on the screen. They understood exactly what I did. They had simply decided it wasn't worth mentioning to people they wanted to impress more than they wanted to acknowledge me. Some kind of administrative capacity. 7 years of overtime, a fractured wrist, a man I'd pulled out of a car 11 days earlier, all of it reduced to 4 words designed to make sure nobody asked a second question. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened Saturday, because I think some of you already know exactly where I was sitting that morning. I almost wore the navy dress. I laid both of them out on my bed, the dress and the uniform, the way I imagine you'd lay out 2 different versions of a person, and I thought about how much smaller my life would feel if I let that dress win. Then I thought about the man I'd pulled out of that sedan, who I still didn't know was going to be standing in that ballroom, and about every overtime shift I'd worked to keep a roof that, it turned out, had never needed fixing. I put on the uniform. I didn't wear it into the ceremony. That part wasn't for me, and I wasn't going to let anything pull a single eye away from Cole and Annika on their actual day, whatever I felt about the rest of it. I sat in the back in regular clothes and watched my little brother get married, and for about 10 minutes none of the rest of it mattered, because he looked terrified and happy and Annika looked at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life, and I am not made of stone. I cried real tears. Family is a strange arithmetic. You can know exactly how little someone has fought for you and still love them with your whole chest. Then the ceremony ended, and the 200 guests started drifting across the lawn toward the reception, and I went to the side room where my garment bag was hanging, closed the door, and put the uniform on piece by piece. Sling aside, dress blues over the brace on my wrist, the small dented academy pin Grandpa Walter gave me the day I graduated, fastened where it's always fastened, just under the collar where nobody sees it but me. I was reaching for the door when it opened first. My mother stood there in champagne silk with her face already arranged for the room outside, and the second she saw the uniform, the arrangement cracked. "What are you doing?" she said, low and fast, pulling the door shut behind her so the hallway couldn't hear. "We talked about this." I told her quietly that I had thought about it, and that I'd decided to wear my uniform to my brother's wedding, and that I wasn't going to make a scene, and that she could trust me on that part. She didn't hear any of it. "These are not our kind of people, Reese," she said, and her hands were actually shaking. You do not get to turn Cole's wedding into a parade because you want attention for what happened on that highway. Her eyes were wet, the kind of wet that's half plea and half threat. Don't you dare embarrass us in there. I looked at my mother, and underneath the anger I could see the scared 16-year-old in 2 pairs of worn-out shoes that Grandpa Walter had told me about 3 nights earlier, and I felt for her. I did, and I still said the only thing I had left to say. Mom, I'm not the embarrassing one. Then I reached past her, opened the door, and walked out into the light before either of us could take a single word of it back. The ballroom at Sterling Oaks has the kind of ceiling that makes a string quartet sound bigger than it is. Tall windows letting in that gold late afternoon light. 200 people in clusters with champagne, waiting to be called to sit. I came in along the back wall, the way I'd promised myself I would. No plan beyond taking my seat quietly and being exactly myself for once. I'd been placed, I noticed without much surprise, at table 11, the farthest one from the head table, the one closest to the kitchen doors. I made it about 10 steps along that wall before I felt the room shift the way a room does right before it understands something. A woman near me stopped mid-sentence. A man touched his wife's elbow and nodded toward me. I kept my eyes forward and my pace even, the way you learn to move when you don't want to startle anybody, and found my mother in the crowd without meaning to. She was mid-laugh with a cluster of Pierce family guests, and I watched the laugh die on her face the second she saw me. The toast started not long after everyone found their seats. The best man first, a little too long and a little too drunk, then Annika's mother, gracious and brief. Then Richard Pierce stood up, a broad, silver-templed man in a perfectly cut gray suit, and the room settled the way rooms do for the person whose name is on the building everyone parked in front of. He talked about his daughter for a minute, about watching her grow into someone who chose her own people instead of the people he'd have picked for her, and the room laughed in the right places. Then his voice changed. I want to use 1 more minute of your patience, he said, because 11 days ago I was supposed to be standing here as a man who'd had a very different kind of week. He told them briefly about the fog on Route 9, about the truck and the ice and the car that flipped onto its roof with him inside it. A few people who'd seen the local news shifted in their seats. I heard somebody near me whisper, the trooper in the high beams, and felt the old urge to disappear rise up in my chest like a wave. I never got to thank the trooper who pulled me out of that car, Richard said. I called the department twice trying to get a name so I could send something, anything, and all they'd give me was a last name, Sergeant Calloway. He said it slowly, the way you say a name you've been carrying around in your head for 11 days. I've been saying that name to myself every morning since, trying to figure out how to thank someone I've never met. And then he looked out at the room, the way you do when you're scanning for the family you're toasting, and his eyes moved past the Calloway table and stopped on the back wall, on me, on a woman in dress blues with a fractured wrist in a brace and a nameplate over her right pocket that read Calloway in plain block letters. And I watched understanding land on his face in real time, the way it does when 2 facts that had no business being related suddenly are. That's, he started and stopped. Then, quieter, like he was confirming it to himself before he said it to 200 people. That's her. The room turned to look at where he was looking. I have never in 9 years on the job felt more exposed than I did in that half-second, standing against a wall in a uniform my own mother had begged me not to wear, watching a room full of strangers realize who I was at the exact same moment my own family did. Richard Pierce set his glass down and crossed the ballroom floor toward me through a silence that felt like it had its own weight, and when he reached me, he didn't say anything clever, didn't perform for the room the way I half expected a man like him to. He just took my unbroken hand in both of his and held it, and his eyes were wet in a way that had nothing to do with champagne. You're Cole's sister, he said, like the realization was still arriving in pieces. The trooper I've been trying to thank for 11 days is my new daughter-in-law's sister-in-law, and nobody in this family thought that was worth mentioning to me. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like a man doing arithmetic out loud and not liking the answer. Then he turned, still holding my hand, and told the room the rest of it. How he'd been trapped, how the smoke had started before help arrived, how the trooper who pulled him clear had turned right back around to check on the next car instead of waiting for backup, and how that decision was the reason she was standing there with a fractured wrist instead of standing there at all. "I built my business on the idea that you take care of the people who take care of you," he said. I have spent 11 days trying to find a way to thank Sergeant Calloway. I had no idea she'd already married into doing it for free. What happened next is the part I still think about more than almost anything else from that day. I counted them later because I needed to. 9 people stood up, scattered across that ballroom, not all at once, but in a slow ripple, the way understanding moves through a crowd. A paramedic from a different unit who'd worked a different stretch of the same wreck. A firefighter Richard had specifically invited because his crew had cut the second car free. A tow truck operator who'd hauled 3 of the vehicles off that bridge before sunrise. And near the back, half rising before he caught himself, Theo, who'd been seated 3 tables from me all night without either of us planning it. His face doing something complicated between pride and the specific exhaustion of a man who'd watched the woman he loves get hurt, and then watched her family try to erase the reason why. My mother found her voice the way she always finds it, fast and bright and aimed at salvaging the room. She crossed toward me with both hands out, face arranged into something that was trying very hard to look like pride. "We are just so proud of her," she said, loud enough for the tables nearby. "We've always been so proud of our Reese." A few guests who didn't know better smiled, ready to believe in a nice moment. But it came too fast and too bright, the voice of someone improvising over a collapse, and when she saw in my face that I wasn't going to smile back and let her rewrite the last 6 months in 10 seconds, the pride curdled into something thinner. She leaned close enough that only I could hear it. "Don't do this," she whispered. "Not here. We can talk about all of it later." I didn't raise my voice. The whole room was still half watching, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely calm in front of my mother. "You spent 6 months afraid I'd embarrass you," I said, quiet enough that the words didn't carry past the 2 of us, even though every word of it was true and I wasn't ashamed of a single syllable. "You put me at table 11. You told everyone to call my job an administrative capacity. And the man you were trying so hard to impress just stood up in front of his whole family and said my name like it mattered. You read the room backward, Mom. You hid the one thing they would have stood up for." She had no answer. Her eyes went looking for an ally, Richard, the Pierces, anyone to tell her she was still right, and found nobody. That's when Grandpa Walter, who'd been sitting quietly at the Calloway table all afternoon with his cane against his chair, got up slowly and crossed the floor with the folder he'd been carrying since the hospital, the one he'd told me wasn't ready that night. He set it on the head table, the brittle elastic bands around it finally giving way after God knows how many years. And he spoke for the first time since the ceremony, in that dry gravel voice that somehow filled the room more than my mother's whisper ever could. "I knew," he said, to the relatives, not to my mother. "I've known for years exactly where the money in this family was actually going, and I let it go on longer than I should have because I kept hoping Pam would stop on her own." He opened the folder and drew out a stapled document with a lawyer's letterhead on the cover. "This is a trust I set up 4 years ago. The cabin on the lake, what's left of my savings, none of it goes to Pam. It never has. It's held for Reese, the way I always intended, because I have spent 40 years watching this family decide who gets to be trusted with something that matters, and I was not going to let that decision get made wrong twice." My mother's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before. The performance simply fell away, and underneath it was raw panic, because the family she'd built her whole identity managing had just watched the floor get pulled out from under her by her own father, in front of the exact people she'd spent 6 months performing for. "You'll regret this," she said to me, low, the tears arriving fast now, though I no longer believed they were entirely real. "After everything I've done for you. You sent $151,000 somewhere over 7 years, Mom," I said, just as quiet, just as level. 18,000 of it actually went to Dad's shop. 9,000 actually touched the mortgage. I have the statements, and I'm not interested in arguing about them in the middle of Cole's reception. I canceled the transfers from my hospital bed 11 days ago. I'm not asking you to pay anything back. I'm telling you it's done." My father had been standing near the head table through all of it, the way he always stands, present and silent, and for one suspended second I watched him open his mouth like he might finally say something that cost him. "Pam," he started. "The shop never needed." My mother's head snapped toward him, the same look she's given him for 30 years, and he stopped and looked down at his hands, and that was the last word my father had on the subject that day. I felt something in me let him go. Gently, the way you let go of an expectation you've been carrying so long it started to feel like a fact about the world instead of a hope. Cole found me near the windows a few minutes later, away from the worst of it, his tie loosened, his face doing the thing faces do when they're trying to catch up to something that already happened. "I didn't know," he said, "about the money or the wreck or any of it. I asked you if you were okay, and then I asked about the dress in the same breath, and I didn't even hear myself do it." He wasn't performing. There was nothing left in the room for him to perform for. "I'm sorry, Reese, I mean it." I told him it was his wedding day, that he should go find his wife, that we could talk tomorrow. And I meant the second part more than I'd ever meant anything like it before. Because there's a real difference between a family that doesn't ask and a family that's just starting to learn how. Annika came and found me last, near the coat check, still in her dress, and she didn't say anything about the toast or the trust or the look on my mother's face. She just hugged me, careful of the sling, and said, "I'm so glad it's you in this family." The same sentence she'd said to me on a phone call 18 months earlier, except this time it landed completely different because now she knew exactly what she was thanking me for, and so did I. The calls started 2 days after the wedding, once a bounced country club payment notice actually reached my mother's inbox instead of mine. She tried sweetness first, the voice she saves for waiters and relatives she needs something from. "Honey, I think there's been some kind of mix-up with the account. The dues didn't go through." I told her it wasn't a mix-up. Silence, then the guilt, right on schedule. "After everything your father and I have done for you." I let her finish. Then Aunt Deb called that same afternoon, my mother's older sister, a retired middle school principal who has never once apologized for being exactly as direct as she sounds. She'd already heard the whole story, from 3 different cousins who'd all been at the wedding and couldn't agree on a single detail except the part where Richard Pierce crossed that ballroom floor. "Your mother just called me sobbing about a country club bill," Aunt Deb said, and I told her if she wanted sympathy about losing a membership she paid for with somebody else's overtime, she could try the Pierces, because Lord knows they heard the whole thing firsthand. Aunt Deb wasn't being cruel. She was just, for the first time in longer than I could remember, being honest in a room my mother couldn't control. My mother called me one more time after that, 3 days later, not sweet this time, full volume, asking if I had any idea what I'd done to her standing in this town. I told her I had a very specific idea, since I'd been the one paying for most of it. She hung up. She hasn't called since, and Grandpa Walter tells me that's mostly fine by everyone except her. Here's how the rest of it settled, because I know you want to know. Grandpa Walter's trust held. A lawyer my mother hired looked at the paperwork for about an hour and told her, off the record, that fighting it would cost more than she'd ever get back. The cabin on the lake stays in my name now, and Grandpa Walter still spends his summers there, which was always the point. My mother's country club membership lapsed 2 months later when the dues went unpaid for the first time in 7 years. She still tells people, when she tells people anything, that I had a hard time after the accident. I let her. Some stories aren't worth correcting in real time. The ones that matter correct themselves eventually, and in a town the size of Millbrook, they generally do. The leased Lincoln went back early. My father picked up extra shifts at the hardware store to cover what was left of the real mortgage. The actual $9,000 he'd never known was the only honest number in the whole arrangement. And he calls me now most Sundays, short calls, mostly about weather and the local football scores, but he calls, which he never used to do, and I always pick up. Cole and Annika are still figuring out what it means to build a marriage on top of a family that just had its foundation publicly inspected. Richard Pierce, I'm told, still introduces me at dealership events as the trooper whose family now, the real way, which is its own kind of repair, slow and a little overcorrected, the way most honest repairs are. I got a departmental commendation for the Route 9 response, the kind with a small ceremony and a photo that ran in the same local paper that had once called me a silhouette in the headlights without knowing my name. My mother did not come. Aunt Deb did, sat in the front row, and afterward told me she was prouder of me than she'd ever managed to say out loud before, which I believed, because Aunt Deb has never once said anything she didn't mean. I still keep Grandpa Walter's Academy pin under my collar, even though it's a little more dented now than it used to be. Most nights I work the same stretch of Route 9, and most nights nothing happens worth telling anyone about, which is its own kind of good outcome. But sometimes the fog rolls in off the reservoir the way it did that night, and my headlights bounce off it and come right back at me, and I think about how long I spent being the light for people who never once turned around to see who was driving. Here's the only thing I took from all of it, and I'll give it to you the way Grandpa Walter gave it to me. The people worth being seen by already understand exactly what your headlights are for. It's usually only your own family that needs you to dim them. That's my story. One uniform, one folder, and a man I pulled out of a car who said my name before my own mother ever did. If somebody in your life has only ever loved the parts of you that were convenient to explain, take this as your sign to stop dimming. Tell me in the comments what you'd have worn to that wedding, the dress or the uniform, and if this one got you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe, because Beyond the Headlights has a lot more of these, and I'll see you in the next one.